It begins quietly, almost insultingly quietly, not with sirens or breaking news alerts, but with an envelope sliding beneath wrought iron gates in a secluded California enclave where privacy is currency and silence is bought by the acre. No logo, no legal theatrics, just a sterile notice containing 7 words capable of detonating a lifestyle built on illusion. Insurance policy will not be renewed. At exactly 10 in the morning, the paper is opened, and in that instant, the American reinvention collapses under its own weight. This is not a tabloid fairy tale about bruised egos or royal jealousy. This is a story written in numbers, clauses, and deadlines, arithmetic that does not recognize titles, trauma, or inheritance. Because while the world obsessed over interviews and carefully framed grievances, a far more ruthless force was closing in from the margins: financial reality. The house itself is magnificent in the way excess always is: hillside views, sprawling land, endless rooms that echo even when full. But in California's wildfire corridors, beauty has become a liability. Insurers aren't renegotiating anymore, they're exiting entirely. Whole neighborhoods are being erased from coverage maps, deemed statistically indefensible, and when coverage disappears, the clock starts ticking. What most homeowners never realize until it's too late is that a mortgage is not just a payment agreement, it is a conditional truce. The bank does not care about sentiment or intent, it cares about collateral. The moment insurance lapses, the loan enters technical default. No missed payment required, no grace period, just a quiet legal switch flipped from performing to at risk. That envelope wasn't an inconvenience, it was a countdown. There were perhaps days, hours even, before lawyers would begin preparing documents that don't make exceptions for famous names. Securing replacement coverage for a multi-million-dollar estate in a high-risk fire zone requires immediate liquidity, 6 figures up front, cash. According to those familiar with the situation, that money was not readily available, so the call was made, not to an institution, not to a banker, but to the last person associated with unconditional rescue. The call crossed time zones, reached London at dawn, and lasted less than 5 minutes. There was no negotiation, no emotional sparring, just a request framed as temporary relief, a bridge loan to stop the bleeding, and then a response so short it felt surgical. The transfer would not happen. The refusal wasn't rooted in cruelty, it was rooted in preparation, because the person on the other end of that call had already done what any responsible steward would do. He had reviewed the numbers, commissioned a full financial overview, not out of spite, but out of obligation, and what he saw wasn't a rough patch, it was a structural collapse in slow motion. The mansion was never an asset, it was a consumption engine, a property whose annual costs rival the lifetime earnings of most people. Taxes alone crossed 6 figures every year without negotiation. Water usage in a drought-stricken state incurred penalties disguised as bills. Maintenance scaled exponentially with size, every additional bathroom, every landscaped acre multiplying the probability of failure. This wasn't wealth, it was exposure. There is a difference between institutional money and personal money. One is designed to absorb shock, the other bleeds quickly when mismanaged. The house demanded constant feeding, and it did not care whether contracts were renewed or deals delayed. It consumed regardless. The conclusion was unavoidable. Injecting capital wouldn't solve the problem, it would only prolong it. Every dollar would vanish into upkeep, insurance gaps, security, optics, never stabilizing, always demanding more. This wasn't a rescue scenario, it was a sinkhole. It became clear that the problem was never a single expense. It was the architecture of the entire life built around the house. Because estates like that don't function on autopilot. They require systems, staff, security, logistics, constant oversight. And for a long time, those systems existed only because someone else was paying for them. Behind the scenes, there had been a second pillar holding everything upright: quiet, generous, powerful, a benefactor whose name carried weight far beyond Hollywood contracts. When the move to America first happened, that support had looked like friendship, offering shelter, protection, reassurance in a hostile environment. But friendship, at that level of wealth, often blurs into something more transactional without anyone formally acknowledging it. The security alone was staggering, not private guards in polo shirts, but elite professionals, the kind normally assigned to heads of state. Their presence created an image of importance, of continued global relevance. It also burned through cash at a rate most people cannot comprehend. For months, then years, that burn rate was quietly absorbed by someone else. At first it worked, the illusion held, bills were paid before they became problems, gaps were filled before they became emergencies, but the danger of invisible support is that it delays consequences. It creates a reality where spending decisions are divorced from income, where optics matter more than sustainability. Slowly, patterns emerged. Resources that could have been redirected toward long-term stability were instead poured into appearance. Flights that could have been commercial were chartered. Public appearances were styled as if global cameras were guaranteed. Public relations firms were retained to manage narratives that were increasingly disconnected from outcomes. The benefactor noticed. People who build empires from nothing always do. They recognize the difference between investment and indulgence, between helping someone build and helping someone pretend. The moment of reckoning did not come with drama. It came with exhaustion, a realization that generosity had turned into maintenance, that support had become expectation, and that nothing sustainable was being built on top of it. When the call came, another request framed as temporary, another appeal to shared history, it was met with a boundary instead of reassurance. The message was simple and devastating in its clarity. This arrangement would not continue. With that decision, more than money disappeared. Credibility vanished with it. In elite circles, backing is a signal. When a self-made billionaire steps away, others take note. Questions begin forming quietly, then spreading. Why now? What changed? What risk am I missing? The effects were immediate. The security presence scaled down. The atmosphere around the property changed. Not unsafe, but unmistakably downgraded. When the most expensive line item gets reduced, it tells a story louder than any press release. This withdrawal coincided with something even more dangerous unfolding elsewhere. The revenue streams that were supposed to justify the lifestyle weren't just slowing, they were reversing. The landmark media deal that had been announced with such fanfare was never what the headlines suggested. It wasn't a reward, it was an advance, money given in anticipation of work yet to be delivered. And in entertainment, advances are debts disguised as opportunities. Initial projects had landed, attention had followed, but momentum stalled. Announced concepts never materialized, production schedules slipped into silence. Executives who expected pipelines received excuses. Contracts remember everything enthusiasm forgets. Buried in legal language few celebrities ever read carefully are clauses designed for exactly this situation. If content is not delivered, advances can be reclaimed. The demand did not arrive as gossip, it arrived as paperwork. Suddenly, the next expected payment was replaced by a request to return funds already spent. Millions. At the exact moment liquidity mattered most. And then came the insult that burned deeper than any financial threat. A senior industry figure, no longer bound by contractual politeness, used a word publicly that redefined the narrative overnight. Not creators, not visionaries, grifters. Once that label enters circulation, doors don't just close, they seal. This was the moment the remaining lifelines snapped. Because reputation, in those circles, is collateral, and once it's damaged, no amount of pleading restores it. By the time the next conversation happened, the one where a final request was made to quietly make the problem disappear, the answer was already determined. Institutional funds are not emergency cushions for failed private ventures. They exist for continuity, not damage control. The verdict was not emotional, it was logistical. The house had to go. Not as punishment, as necessity. And with that conclusion, the final illusion shattered, because selling a symbol of success is never just a transaction, it's an admission. But admitting failure publicly was not an option, so the exit had to be invisible. The decision didn't come with anger. That was the most unsettling part. There was no shouting, no accusation, no rehashing of old wounds, just a calm explanation that felt colder than any argument ever could. This wasn't about family loyalty versus betrayal. It was about math versus denial, and math always wins. Selling the house, however, was not as simple as calling an agent and scheduling photographs. That kind of listing would have been a global headline within hours, a public marker of retreat, proof that the narrative of independence had collapsed under its own weight. So the strategy shifted into something quieter, more desperate. The property would be moved through private channels, shown discreetly to buyers who valued anonymity over leverage. In real estate, that approach has a name: off-market, pocket listing. In healthy situations, it's about privacy. In failing ones, it's about time, because time was now the most expensive resource they didn't have. Banks are patient until they aren't. Once an asset becomes uninsured, the tone changes. Courtesy evaporates. Everything becomes procedural. Notices are drafted, internal committees meet. Decisions are made by people who have never watched an interview or read a headline. To them, it's not a prince in distress, it's a risk profile deteriorating in real time. And while the legal machinery began quietly warming up, another kind of isolation set in. Social isolation, the kind that doesn't announce itself but becomes obvious in hindsight. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. Rooms that once felt welcoming grew colder. This wasn't spite, it was self preservation. In elite circles, financial trouble is contagious. No one wants to be adjacent to the moment when a casual lunch turns into a favor request or a friendly check in becomes a conversation about just needing something short term. People pull back not because they don't care, but because they do the math. And the math says distance is safer. Places that once symbolized belonging became reminders of exclusion. Private clubs where deals are whispered suddenly felt louder, more exposed. Eye contact shortened, conversations ended early. Not hostility, avoidance, the most brutal social cue of all. Meanwhile, the house continued to drain resources even as it sat quietly above the coastline. Utilities, staff, taxes. Every day unsold was another cut, and the longer it lingered, the weaker their negotiating position became. Buyers sense urgency, the way predators sense blood in the water. The irony was suffocating. The very home meant to represent freedom had become a trap, a physical anchor tying them to obligations they could no longer comfortably meet. And the longer they waited, the more control slipped away. At this point, the advice from London was no longer optional. It wasn't about pride or optics anymore. It was about damage containment, because if the sale didn't happen on their terms, it would happen on the bank's. Foreclosure doesn't knock politely. It announces itself loudly, publicly, permanently, and once that word enters the story, no rebrand survives it. This was the moment the realization finally set in. Not all support is abandonment. Not all refusals are betrayals. Sometimes the most brutal kindness is letting consequences arrive unfiltered. The final instruction wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as the only remaining move on the board. Eliminate the liability, reduce exposure, stop the bleed. But even as that reality settled in, another question loomed larger than the house itself. Because selling a property is survivable, losing belief from investors, from allies, from peers, that is harder to recover from. The experiment that was supposed to prove independence had instead exposed dependence in its rawest form. Dependence on advances, on benefactors, on appearances, on the assumption that money would always arrive before the bill did. And now, standing at the edge of that realization, there was nowhere left to redirect blame. The contracts were signed willingly, the expenses were chosen deliberately, the warnings had been there, ignored in favor of momentum and confidence. What remained was not just a financial reckoning, but an identity crisis. Because when the symbols are stripped away, the house, the security, the access, what's left has to stand on its own. And for the first time since leaving everything behind, that question had no immediate answer. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but something slower and more punishing: exposure. The kind that strips away insulation layer by layer until there is nothing between you and consequence. Because once the decision to sell was made, everything else had to adjust around it, and those adjustments told a story no press statement could control. The downgrade was subtle at first: fewer staff on rotation, shorter contracts, services renegotiated instead of renewed. In wealthy neighborhoods, these changes are noticed immediately, even when no one comments on them. Discretion is the language of that world, but observation is its instinct, and the observations were not flattering. At the same time, the remaining commercial relationships began behaving differently. Emails took longer to answer, meetings were postponed indefinitely, promises became conditional. What had once been pitched as long-term partnerships were quietly reframed as exploratory conversations. No one said the word risk, but it hung in the air like humidity. This is the phase most people misunderstand. They think failure is loud. It isn't. Failure at this level is administrative. It's lawyers switching tone. It's accountants flagging items in red instead of green. It's the sudden insistence on clauses that were previously waived as a courtesy. The real damage wasn't financial anymore, it was reputational, because wealth ecosystems run on confidence, not belief in talent, but belief in continuity. The idea that tomorrow will look roughly like today, only better. Once that illusion breaks, money doesn't flee emotionally, it reallocates rationally. And that's when the isolation became undeniable. Friends who once spoke warmly about shared projects suddenly emphasized how busy they were. Connections that had been presented as deep revealed themselves to be shallow. The truth emerged quietly. Proximity had been mistaken for loyalty, access mistaken for alliance. In that vacuum, resentment could have grown, but what replaced it was something far more dangerous: justification. The temptation to believe that the world had turned unfair, that doors were closing out of spite rather than self interest. That belief is comforting. It also prevents correction. Back in London, the assessment remained unchanged. No additional funds, no intervention, no institutional rescue, not because compassion was absent, but because precedent mattered. Once you convert a public institution into a personal bailout mechanism, it stops being either. The message delivered without cruelty was final: rebuild smaller or be crushed larger. That is the moment where the story stops being about one house or one failed deal. It becomes about scale, about the mismatch between income and ambition, between narrative and infrastructure, between who you think you are and what your balance sheet allows you to be. Because independence is not declared, it is earned repeatedly through restraint. The house, looming quietly above the coastline, became a symbol of that lesson, not of luxury, but of overreach, a reminder that freedom built on leverage is not freedom at all. It's borrowed time. As preparations for the sale moved forward, another reality settled in. There would be no immediate replacement, no equivalent estate, no seamless transition into another version of the same life. Downsizing would not be a choice, it would be a requirement. And with that came the hardest adjustment of all: invisibility. Because without spectacle, without excess, without constant validation, attention fades. And when attention fades, so does leverage. You are forced to confront the value of what you produce, not who you are. This is where most experiments end, not with bankruptcy, but with recalibration, with the quiet understanding that the previous model is no longer viable and that clinging to it will only accelerate decline. What remained now was a narrowing corridor of options, each one less glamorous than the last, each one demanding humility instead of assertion. And for someone who had spent years framing departure as liberation, the realization cut deep. Leaving was easy, building was not. By the time the final paperwork was being prepared, the narrative had already shifted beyond repair. Not publicly, not yet, but structurally. The kind of shift that doesn't need headlines to be real. The kind that shows up in bank statements, in legal correspondence, in the silence where reassurance used to be. This was no longer about punishment or pride. It was about gravity, about the inescapable pull that returns every inflated life to a scale it can actually sustain. The house was just the most visible casualty. The deeper loss was momentum. When people talk about starting over, they imagine reinvention as something dramatic: new ventures, bold announcements, fresh branding. But real resets are quieter. They involve subtraction, not addition, fewer commitments, smaller spaces, lower ceilings, both literal and symbolic. The illusion that independence could be maintained through visibility alone had collapsed. Exposure without output had proven useless. Narrative without delivery had exhausted its audience. And wealth, unlike sympathy, does not renew itself automatically. What remained was an uncomfortable clarity. The rules that apply to everyone else had finally arrived, delayed but undeterred. Mortgages don't negotiate with symbolism. Contracts don't honor intention. And benefactors, no matter how generous, eventually stop financing lifestyles that refuse to adapt. In that sense, the refusal from London was not abandonment, it was alignment with reality, because continuing to intervene would not have saved anything. It would have simply postponed the reckoning while deepening the damage. Family loyalty is powerful, but it cannot override structural failure without becoming complicit in it. And sometimes the most responsible thing a protector can do is step aside and allow consequences to teach what advice could not. The house would change hands, quietly, if possible, without ceremony, without the validation of a bidding war, just a transaction, stripped of symbolism. And when that happened, the chapter would close not with applause or outrage, but with something far more final: acceptance. The American experiment did not end in flames, it ended in accounting. And that may be the most brutal ending of all, because there is no villain to blame, no conspiracy to expose, only decisions multiplied over time, colliding with limits that never cared who made them. This story resonates far beyond titles or tabloid fascination because it exposes a universal truth. Lifestyle is not freedom, scale is not success, and independence is not proven by what you leave behind, but by what you can sustain without rescue. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the loss of excess, the kind that forces reflection instead of reaction. In that silence, the future is no longer imagined as something owed, but something earned slowly, deliberately, without spectacle. Whether that lesson leads to reinvention or retreat remains unseen. But one thing is certain: the era of living ahead of consequence has ended. In the end, no crown was required to learn this lesson, just time, just numbers, just the refusal of one final bailout. And perhaps that refusal, painful as it was, will prove to be the only gift that still had value left to give. The experiment is over, the accounting is complete, and what comes next will finally have to be real.